And this is our final movie in the setup section of the Logic Games chapter. And in this movie, we're going to introduce the rules, which are the other major part of every game. Okay, so this text is highlighted. Those are the rules. And rules are statements that are found underneath a game scenario. They're always going to be underneath a game scenario, and they function to limit the possible number of arrangements. If we didn't have any rules in this game, the runners A, B, C, D, and E win first to fifth place, would have probably over 100 different possible arrangements that you could arrange the different runners. But the rules reduce that number significantly. There are basically three types of rules. And to highlight the text here, these first four rules are the first type, the rules that relate movable elements to one another. And these rules all tell you that there's some kind of relationship between certain movable elements that you need to pay attention to when you're making an arrangement. The second type of rule is highlighted here. It's the last rule that we have in our game here, and it's rules that relate movable elements to structural elements. So here it says the runner C can't be last. Last is a structural element, runner C is a movable element. And this rule tells you that there's some kind of relationship between certain movable elements and certain structural elements that you need to pay attention to when you're making an arrangement. And the third type of rule are rules that relate structural elements to one another. And these types of rules aren't represented in this game, and they don't appear as often as the other two. They're usually found more in grouping games. Okay, so for the rules, you need to check the rules in order to make arrangements, because the rules guide you in telling you what has to be true and what can't be true. So they're very important in making arrangements. And you need to use symbols to represent the rules. Now, you should make those symbols accessible, and you should add them to the structure if possible. And you should use symbols that make sense to you. There's no prize for getting the best symbols or the best representation. The point is to have something that you'll be able to look at and understand quickly what has to be true and what can't be true when you're making an arrangement. As with the movable and structural elements, place the rule representations somewhere where you'll be able to refer to them easily as you're doing the questions. I generally put them right underneath wherever I put my diagram for the movable and structural elements. Okay. So now we're going to introduce and explain the basic types of rules for sequential games. So the game that we have up here is a sequential game. It talks about runners A, B, C, D, and E, and it talks about them winning first to fifth place. So the first rule says that runner E is before runner B. Now, in order to show that an element goes before or after another element, you should connect them with a line. And this rule can be symbolized by placing the E to the left of the B. And notice that it doesn't let us know what spots they're in or if there are any other elements between E and B. It just lets us know that in any arrangement we make, E is going to have to be to the left of B. Okay, looking at the second rule, it says that runner D is before runner B. Now, you should add additional lines if other rules mention other elements. So we already have B, and now the second rule mentions D. So in this rule, we can symbolize it by placing a line between D and the B already up there. And in this way, you can generally develop a picture of how all of the movable elements are related to one another. Now, notice that in this case, we don't know who goes first between E and D. We just know that they're both going to be found before B. And actually, some games are only going to have these kinds of rules, where you're just going to eventually end up putting all of the movable elements, you're going to relate them all to one another in terms of who goes before whom. Okay, so the third rule says that runner A is separated by 2 spots from runner C. Now, in order to show that an element goes a specific number of spaces before or after another element, you should connect them with dashes. Now, in this case, make sure to have both possibilities if the rule doesn't specify before or after, in which case it doesn't. It just says that it's separated by 2 spots from C. So, as I just said, we can symbolize this rule with dashes that indicate the number of spaces in between the elements, 2 dashes here between C and A and C. And that's actually different from a line which indicates relative position, because the line that indicates relative position is just a straight line connecting the two, and it's not at the bottom, and it's not a separate number of dashes. And like I mentioned, notice that this rule doesn't tell us which of the two runners is going to be found first, A or C. That's why we have those two possibilities up there. We have C dash dash A and then or A dash dash C. This rule says, rule number 4 says that runner C has to be next to B. In order to show that elements go or don't go adjacent to one another, you should use a box. Once again, make sure you have both possibilities if the rule doesn't specify before or after, and you can cross out if the rule says that the elements aren't adjacent. So we'll symbolize this by putting the two elements inside a box. We'll have C and B inside a box next to one another. And since this rule doesn't tell us whether C or B is going to be first, we'll put C and B in the box with C first, and then or B and C in a box with B first. And the last rule says that runner C can't be last. And in order to show that an element goes or doesn't go somewhere, add the information directly to the structure. If it can't go somewhere, place it underneath the spot and cross it out. And if it may go somewhere, place it under the spot in parentheses, just to let you know that maybe it can go there. So here the rule specifies that runner C can't occupy certain spots, spot number 5, so we'll put C underneath and cross it out. And the reason it's helpful to put it directly in the diagram that you have with the structural elements, because that just makes it much easier to make an arrangement as soon as you look at the diagram. Okay, so these are the basic rules and basic ways of symbolizing them for the sequential games. So let's take a look at this game, which is a representation of a grouping game. Runners A, B, C, D, and E, and F are being divided into two teams of 3 people. So 2 teams of 3 people. Say the structure elements are grouping elements. So the first 2 rules say that runner A is in the same group as B, and runner D is not in the same group as B. And in order to show that elements go or don't go together, use a circle and cross out if the rule says the elements aren't in the same group. So here we'll use a circle, and we need to keep in mind that this is different from the rule for the sequencing games, where we use the square to indicate that the elements were next to one another. Here we're using a circle to show that the elements are together. And this is just a system that we've developed and that works well. You can of course use anything that makes sense for you as long as you're consistent. So we have A and B inside a circle, and D and B inside a circle with a line through it to indicate that it's been crossed out, that they do not go together, that they're not in the same group. The next 2 rules say that runner C is in group 1 and that runner F is not in group 2. And in order to show that an element goes or doesn't go somewhere, you should add the information directly to the structure. And if it can't go in a group, place it under the spot and cross it out or add it to the other group if there are only 2. And this is the same approach as with the sequencing games, where you can add information directly to the structure, then you should do so. And since in this game, if an element isn't in team 1, then it can only be in team 2, so you should add it directly to team 2. So we'll have both C and F underneath the 1 to signify that they're in team 1. And the last rule says that if runner C is in the same group as D, A is not in the same group as F. So you should use the standard symbols for rules with conditional reasoning. As you notice, this is a conditional statement. If runner C is in the same group, then A is not in the same group as F. And you should always make sure to symbolize the contrapositive. The conditional reasoning appears more often in the grouping games than in the sequencing games, so you should pay attention to that. So here we have C and D inside a circle with an arrow towards A and F inside a circle that's crossed out, symbolize that C is in the same group as D and A is not in the same group as an F. And the contrapositive, A and F in a circle, arrow C and D in a circle crossed out. Okay, so there are rules that don't fit these patterns and are specific to the game. So it's not a complicated science. Just use symbols that make sense to you and try to visually represent it so that you can have something that you can quickly look at as you're trying to make an arrangement in order to answer the question. Okay, so to recap, rules act to limit the possible number of arrangements, and accessing the rules is important for doing the questions. So make sure to use symbols that make sense and allow you to quickly evaluate potential arrangements.